After the big news yesterday of the heavy Russian missile strikes across Ukraine and of the further advances of the Wagner forces in Bakhmut, the last 24 hours have been, as is so often the case, quieter. There have apparently been continued advances by the Russian forces, by the Wagner organization in Bakhmut. And we're not getting a huge amount of information about this, but dribbles of information do come through from time to time. So we read, and I'm taking this from Slavyangrad, as I've said many times, a reliable source, in my opinion, for information like this, albeit a pro-Russian one, but to be frank, one gets an awful lot more information from Russian sources about what's going on in Bakhmut on any particular day than one gets from Ukrainian sources. Anyway, the Slavyangrad has provided a number of reports. They say that the fighters of the Wagner organization have entered the territory of the Artyomovsky Medical College and are already in control of several buildings. The advance from the north and near Tchaikovsky Street continues. And then we read a little further that less than a day later, this is also from Slavyangrad, the assault detachments of the Wagner organization have achieved new significant successes in the western districts of the city. Wagner troops in the western districts completely brought under their control some more of the western districts. The Russian Defense Ministry, I understand, refers to 4, and I think we can talk now about 4 apartment blocks, these big apartment blocks. And then it goes on to say that there is air attacks taking place along Pobieda and Levanevskovo streets. Now that actually does beg some interesting questions, because air attacks, by what? By drones? By ground attack aircraft? By helicopters? Or by more powerful bombers? And it says, this is again from Slavyangrad, Wagner forces pushed the enemy out from Polevaya Street and took up a number of positions on Tchaikovsky Street. And this last report comes with a map, and the map does again give us an idea of where the fighting in Bakhmut is going on, and again the area that is now being contested, and it looks extremely small, and the map clearly shows only a small part of Bakhmut, and it's clear that even that part of Bakhmut, which the Ukrainians still control, is now contested in almost every location by the forces of the Wagner group. So clearly the gradual, steady, incremental capture of Bakhmut continues. I don't know how much longer it's going to take, but it's certainly less than 10% that the Ukrainians control now. As I said, 7.5%. I said in a recent video, I think, to be frank, it's probably less than that as well. Bearing in mind that even in those areas, as I said, where the Ukrainians are still clinging on, you find Russian troops, Wagner troops, contesting now every inch of the ground. So that's what's going on in Bakhmut. There have been other reports from other places, never as detailed as what we get from Bakhmut. The Russian reporters, are obviously very interested in the fight from Bakhmut. As I've said already, Prigozhin himself provides us with an almost non-stop commentary about what's going on in that particular battle. But yesterday, Pushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk government, did say that the Russians not only control 50 out of the 59 districts of Marinka, But every other part of Marinka, the 9 districts that the Ukrainians still control, every part of those districts is covered by Russian artillery and mortar fire, and that the Russians are very heavily present throughout that area in Marinka. There's also some reports of further Russian advances in the Avdiivka region. I'm going to suggest that there, again, perhaps the Russian offensive has slowed down, perhaps more because of the mud and difficult weather conditions than anything else. I should say that I did see a picture. It may not be, I'm not sure which army it shows, which army is involved in this picture. I think it's the Ukrainian. And this picture shows an upturned tank. I think it's a T-64, but my ability to identify Soviet-era tanks from pictures is extremely limited, to put it mildly. But anyway, if it is a T-64, it's most probably a Ukrainian tank. Anyway, it's clearly overturned in extremely swampy ground. There's lots of groundwater all over the place, and frankly, it looks as if much of the ground is still flooded out. And I understand, by the way, that there's been more rain recently. This is turning out to be a relatively wet spring in Donbass and in southeastern Ukraine, and that is having an effect on slowing down the movements of all armies. Though I do understand that things are a bit drier further north in the Kremenaya Svatovo area, but there again, as I said, the Russians continue their advances in this large area of forest. And again, I don't have very detailed information about what's going on there, but all the information that I am getting from various sources speaks of incremental Russian advances, again behind downpour of artillery and missile fire and fire from these terrifying TOS-1 multiple rocket launch systems that launch these absolutely devastating thermobaric warheads, which can set vast areas of woodland on fire in the most terrifying way. Anyway, the effect of all of that is that the Ukrainians again continue to feed reinforcements to try to hold positions in this forest. The price they're paying is extremely heavy casualties. The Russians also are claiming that their Air Force, and it does seem to be specifically their Air Force, have been carrying out bombing raids on Ukrainian positions, on areas of concentration of Ukrainian forces. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed yesterday that the Russians carried out what they say are precision-guided strikes. They don't say with what, but my impression is that it's with bombs, because the report does seem to refer to the Russian Air Force. So, precision-guided bomb strikes on Ukrainian troop concentrations, logistic hubs, that kind of thing, all of which appear to have been allocated for the coming Ukrainian counteroffensive, about which, by the way, more shortly. But anyway, that was the report that the Russian Ministry of Defense gave. Obviously, we have very little information about this from the Ukrainian side, but for the record, I've now seen many more reports discussing that attack by Lancet drones on the S-300 system in Kherson region, and it seems that that was actually an operating S-300 system, and it does look as if it was comprehensively destroyed by the Russians through this drone attack, exactly as the Russian the original Russian reports claimed. That, by the way, was a devastating strike. It's one of the most extraordinary attacks on military unit that I have seen over the course of this war. The film is remarkable. And I have to say this, it, for me, comes close, perhaps even exceeds the sense of, well, to an untutored, inexpert eye, astonishment that I felt way back in 1991 when we saw some of the precision-guided bombs that the United States was using against Iraqi installations. And all of that was done in ways that I'd never seen in war before. Turned out, by the way, that an awful lot of that, a lot of that film from 1991 was, shall we say, produced or shown very selectively. It didn't give a full picture by any means of what was going on in the actual war. Most of the bombs that were dropped in 1991 by the Americans on the Iraqis were actually, at that time, still unguided bombs, as I only found out many years later. But anyway, some bombs did fall. They were precision guided. There was some pretty vivid pictures, as I remember. And this attack on that S-300 convoy was at least as astonishing and perhaps disturbing as some of those earlier pictures were. Perhaps for that reason, the Western media has completely ignored the tale of this particular drone strike on this air defense missile convoy, even as the Western media has itself published reports about the depletion of Ukraine's air defense system, which this attack on this particular S-300 brigade will have worsened. Instead, the media today, the Western, at least the British media, are largely focused on the fact that a Ukrainian drone did manage to penetrate Russian air defenses in Crimea and did hit an oil storage depot and did cause a fire in that depot. And I've seen pictures of that, and the Russians have admitted the drone attack. And I have to say, the fire itself, as one would expect, is spectacular. But if one examines the pictures carefully, it's clear that this is a fairly confined fire. In other words, the oil depot that was destroyed was a relatively small one. And I think this is of limited significance. This particular drone strike is of very limited significance and cannot be compared in its dramatic quality and arguably in its consequences to that drone strike, that Russian drone strike with the Lancet drones on the S-300 brigade and its accompanying Gepard anti-aircraft tank. So just mentioning this, thing about war is that, of course, each side is very careful to show us those things which seem to suggest that it's doing well and that the other side is losing. And that's perhaps unsurprising in some ways that the Western media has therefore ignored the attack on the S-300 battery and has talked up this attack on the oil depot. But to my mind, that does again show the extent to which the Western media has taken sides in this war and perhaps isn't reporting it thoroughly and fully as they ought to do. And anyway, we see what actually happened in both cases. I would point out that the Russians have reported the oil depot fire, and it has been discussed in their media, so, they're perhaps being more comprehensive in their news coverage of the war than the Western media have been. But in any event, I don't think the two are comparable. The destruction of the S-300 battery is far more consequential. Far more consequential as well was that big missile strike and drone strike as well, by the way, by the Russians that took place a few hours ago. And perhaps importantly again, it's interesting that we have far less information about it, certainly from the Ukrainians, than we had, and the Western media, than we've had about earlier drone strikes. And I can't help but think that partly the reason is that with the Ukrainian air defenses further depleted, most of the drones this time got through. I noticed that Ukraine claimed that it shot down 11 missiles over Kiev, though it's clear that some did get through. But the media in the West has once again tended to run with that story about the civilians killed in that strike on the residential buildings. As I anticipated, the Russians are saying that none of their missiles landed on any residential buildings at all. They say that these were all Ukrainian air defense missiles that missed their targets and crashed to earth. It would require impartial investigation to establish who's telling the truth. We're not going to get that sort of investigation. I would say this. Firstly, it is not impossible that Russian cruise missiles have missed their targets and hit wrong, incorrect structures, civilian structures. I'm afraid that does happen. And it is also not impossible that these were indeed Ukrainian air defense missiles falling on residential buildings. That has certainly happened in the past. And if it turns out that these were S-300 missiles that caused that destruction, then I'm afraid I'm going to take the view that it was a Ukrainian air defense missiles that almost certainly caused these accidents, because that's surely what they were. And any attempt to spin the story that these were S-300s used by the Russians as ground strike missiles, well, I've already explained clearly why I'm sure that is wrong. So anyway, that's all the information that we have. This was not an attack on the Ukrainian energy system, this Russian attack. Again, I suspect that the Russians are softening up Ukraine's transport and logistics infrastructure that has been built up to support Ukraine's coming offensive. Now, today, there have been two very interesting articles in, of all places, the Daily Telegraph, both of which cast doubt on the prospects of Ukraine's offensive. Now, the Daily Telegraph is probably the newspaper that I have quoted from most often amongst British newspapers covering the war. And the reason for that is actually very simple. The Daily Telegraph is very close to Britain's ruling Conservative Party, and it is very, very close to the British government, which is a Conservative government. And I get the sense that it is also very close to the thinking of the British Defence Ministry and of its intelligence community and all that. It is fervently supportive of Ukraine, but every so often an interesting article appears in it. It is perhaps a more interesting newspaper to read about this conflict than some of the others that get published in Britain. The Financial Times and the London Times also, from time to time, publish interesting articles as well. By contrast, The Guardian is the most fervently pro-Ukrainian newspaper of all, has witnessed some rather strange articles that it's been running recently, like a new one about the fact that there was supposedly a Russian ship of some kind seen close to the Nord Stream pipelines 4 days before they were destroyed, and we're supposed to draw all sorts of conclusions, I suppose, from that, even though the article itself says that the Swedish investigators have already said that as far as they're concerned, this is not news. It's something that's been known about all along. So anyway, I'm not going to waste more time on that. We've had these two very interesting articles from the Daily Telegraph. Now, one, which is written by Dominic Nichols, who is an associate editor, basically casts doubt on the prospects of Ukraine's offensive, but doesn't want to appear to do so too openly. So the title reads, Ukraine has wind in sails ahead of counteroffensive, but Putin will not go down easily. That's the title. But then the subtitle is actually much more revealing. It says the strike against Russian forces needs to come with managed expectations, or pride will be followed by a costly fall. And if you go on and read the article carefully, it says that it's basically saying that it is most unlikely that the Ukrainian offensive will achieve all of its objectives, or at least the objectives that the West, the Western media, some people in Ukraine have been promoting. In other words, it's not going to break through to the Sea of Azov. And it contains comments like this. Talk of an imminent Ukrainian breakthrough is dangerous because of how it frames the debate around success and failure. If launched amid a backdrop of uncaveated expectation, any counteroffensive that proves to be an anticlimax, achieving only a minor advance, say, or one that results in heavy casualties without a decisive breakthrough, or a combination of the two, could fuel calls for a negotiated settlement. And that, of course, is a disaster. We can't have calls for a negotiated settlement. And the article then goes on to complain bitterly that in the West there's this problem of elections, and people might start to get demoralized, and that this is an unfortunate thing because it might cause Western support for Ukraine to falter. That's entirely the way in which this article is framed. And then it claims that, what is success? And it says that one-dimensional thinking about success would be a push through to Melitopol, or the recapture of Mariupol, or the encirclement of thousands of Russian soldiers and vital equipment. And it says, what is the acceptable level of cost? And when does that tip into failure? 5,000, 10,000? I find it, by the way, astonishing that this article speaks so lightly about the possibility of Ukraine losing 5,000 to 10,000 men as a result of this offensive. Bear in mind that the force that's supposed to be launching this offensive is said to number around 48,000. So 5,000 men would be more than 10% of that force. 10,000 would be 20% of that force. An offensive that achieves limited gains at the expense of 20% of the attacking force, in my opinion, is still a failure, undoubtedly, indisputably, however one wants to define failure or success. And then the article says, aiming for modest gains that maintain Ukraine's military strength and coherence without jettisoning international political support may be a better outcome to aim for. Modest aspirations will promote resilience, allowing the development of an intellectual framework for how victory might look that is too narrow and unrealistic, risks creating a fragility in these tense times. Unrealistic expectations could place an unbearable strain on Ukraine's political and military leadership and the international support flowing into the country. Success, it is said, has many fathers. Failure is an orphan, and that is not a position that President Zelensky wants to find himself in. Well, I take this article, despite Mr. Nichols' attempts to argue the contrary, that he fears that this offensive is going to fail. Now, given that that is so, I ask that question I have asked many times. Why, if the chances of success are small, if hopes of a big victory, surrounding thousands of Russian soldiers, breaking through to the Sea of Azov, recapturing Mariupol, all of that kind of thing, if the prospects of that are small, and perhaps setting sights on achieving that kind of thing is unrealistic, if the best that can be achieved, most likely, is capturing a small amount of ground at the cost of 5,000 to 10,000 dead, then what is the sense of going ahead with this counteroffensive at all? Is it not much better to remain on the defensive, conserve forces, try to use this equipment the West has provided in a defensive way, not throw it all away on a counteroffensive whose chances of success, though they cannot be discounted completely, even Mr. Nichols doesn't apparently fully believe in anymore, despite his rather complicated attempts. You have to read the article to see how complicated they are in order to persuade him that it is in fact still Ukraine that is advancing. Well, that's Dominic Nichols. There's another article in the Telegraph which is perhaps gloomier still, and that is from Richard Kemp. Now, Richard Kemp, as I understand it, is an ex-army officer. He's someone who has been writing in the most fervid way in support of Ukraine throughout the conflict. He's one of these people who, I think I'm right in saying this, has been predicting President Putin's demise as a result of this war on a fairly regular basis. But his latest article in the Telegraph reads, "Whisper it, but Ukraine may no longer be winning." And he says, in recent weeks, optimism has been the main feature of analysis regarding Ukraine's chances this winter. And then he says the failure of Russian forces to gain any significant territory since the winter quite understandably excited Western pundits. But there is a risk that we are overstating Kiev's abilities and becoming complacent in the process. I'm going to just take on this topic of the failure of the Russians to gain any significant territory since the winter. Now, way back in the autumn, I was one of those people who did think that there would be, or was likely to be, a winter offensive. Now, others with military backgrounds, which I have not, people like Brian Beletic, Alex Vashinin, Scott Ritter, Douglas McGregor, didn't think so. What all of them thought, as I remember, and this is very powerfully expressed mostly by Brian Beletic, is that the major purpose of the Russian forces over the course of the winter would be to grind the Ukrainians down. And that is exactly, of course, what the Russians have been doing. They've been grinding the Ukrainians down in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka, in Marinka, in Kremenaya Svatovo. They've been inflicting appalling casualties on the Ukrainian troops, casualties in men, casualties in machines, and Russia's missile offensive, of course, as we have seen, has depleted Ukrainian air defense arsenals to exhaustion. And all of these people were right. I was wrong when I said that I thought there would be a Russian offensive in the winter. The Russians have never at any point in time spoken about going on the offensive in the winter. People who talk about a Russian winter offensive are ignoring that fact, and that they are ignoring that the only discussion of strategy by any senior Russian military official was the one provided by General Surovikin in that interview he gave to Russian television all the way back in October, in which he said that he would build fortifications along the front lines, create a reserve, avoid launching big arrow offensives, and grind the Ukrainians down. That is what Surovikin said in October, and that is exactly what the Russians have done. Speaking for myself, I began to think that perhaps the Russians weren't going to launch the winter offensive that I'd been expecting. By the way, Vashinin made the point, amongst others, that the reservists that were being called up would not have the necessary levels of training to conduct an offensive before March at the earliest, and I'm sure he was right. Anyway, what made me made me think that perhaps an offensive of the sort that I'd expected was not going to happen was when it became clear that Surovikin's promise to create these elaborate defenses was actually being fulfilled. What actually happened over the course of the winter, what the Russians did over the course of the winter, was four things. They launched a massive missile offensive over Ukraine, whose purpose, I think it is now clear, was primarily to deplete Ukraine's air defense system, in which it was wholly successful. Secondly, to grind Ukrainian forces down in Donbass with these limited offensives in places like Bakhmut, Avdiivka, the Svatovo-Kremenaya area, around Vuhledar, in Marinka, and that they've also done. Thirdly, to build up, to train up and build up this reserve, with its 160,000 men in reserve, and that they've done also. And last, but far from least, to create this enormous belt of fortifications. Now, why would you build up fortifications on such a scale if your plan was to go on the offensive? Clearly, that was not the Russian plan. The Russian plan was to wait for the Ukrainian offensive which was to come, weather it, defeat it, throw it back, and then perhaps, possibly, go on the offensive yourself. But clearly, the intention of the Russians was to see off this Ukrainian offensive first. And on the topic of this Ukrainian offensive, which is, by the way, the Ukrainian offensive we're talking about, the one from Zaporozhye region, supposedly to the Sea of Azov, to cut off the land bridge. I now understand that it had originally been intended for launch in November. So when I said a short time ago that the Ukrainian sequencing was Kharkiv, Kherson, and then directly after the push from Zaporozhye region all the way down to the Sea of Azov. And this was the original plan, to have it all done before the new year. Ukraine wasn't able to do that because the losses it suffered in the Kharkiv and Kherson offensives were far too high. The Russians, however, knew about this plan. Clearly, they'd figured it out somehow, and they've spent the winter preparing for it. So when it does eventually come, and it's been postponed repeatedly, when it does eventually come, they are ready. So I wanted to set this out because this has obviously been something that's been evolving. Even I, as I said many times, I'm not a military expert. I've gradually come to understand this better as the war has progressed. But anyway, we now see what the thinking is. But this talk about a Russian winter offensive failing to gain significant territory is clearly wrong. It is a misunderstanding of Russian strategy over the winter, even though, as I said, way back in October, no less a person than General Surovikin explained it. Anyway, to continue. And I'm going back now to Richard Kemp's article. Ukraine's defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, is now trying to damp down expectations, which she certainly is, by the way. It is definitely overheated. Everyone wants another victory, Reznikov says. We didn't believe in victory before. We used to want Ukraine to survive at least minimally. This is from Reznikov. And then Kemp goes on to say, Reznikov's words are a critical reality check for those predicting the imminent collapse of Russian forces. We should all adopt such caution, not just to avoid disappointment, but because it also signals the need to plan for a sharp change of gear in our support for Ukraine. The Ukrainian army says it has been generating more than a dozen brigades with tanks, artillery and engineers, much supplied by the West. Whilst continuing to fight in Donbass, the General Staff has been conserving reserves and building them up to form a core that can have a decisive effect against the strengthening Russian defense. But whilst this makes sense, the fighting, especially in Bakhmut, has been very costly in artillery shells and missiles, depleting Kiev's reserve forces. And then Kemp discusses the Pentagon leaks. It talks about the fact that there are now multiple Ukrainian deficiencies, that attacking fortified positions could be very difficult, that the Ukrainians face a very tough fight indeed, and that, in his words, this offensive will be a very different proposition to the amazing successes last year at Kharkiv and Kherson against this thinly spread enemy, willing to trade ground for time. That's the first time I've seen, by the way, a Western commentator admit this. Beletic has been saying this for months, that the Russians have always been prepared to trade ground in order to conserve forces, in effect, to trade ground for time. Kemp, for the first time, as far as I know, admits that that was the case last autumn. The Ukrainians gained ground because the Russians decided to cede it. They decided to cede it rather than suffer disproportionate losses, trying to defend it at a time when their forces were thinly stretched. And then Kemp goes on to say, it could all mean that rather than a series of victories and ever-increasing momentum, the coming months bring yet another stalemate. And then he talks about the fact that if that happens, in other words, the Ukrainian offensive fails, that could lead to increasing demands for a diplomatic settlement of the conflict. And he says that as long as Ukraine has the will to keep fighting, it must never be left to the whims of disingenuous actors who sensing a stalemate, will try to force it to make peace on unfavourable terms. Western complacency may lead to such a disaster in the autumn, and we should make it clear that if this offensive fails, we will redouble our support. In other words, if Ukraine fails, we mustn't give up. We must go on fighting, and even more Ukrainians must die. We mustn't even consider the option of trying to look for an end to the war. Now, just take a step back and think what that means, because yet again, Mr. Kemp, like Mr. Nichols, like so many others, sees everything entirely on the basis of what the Western powers and Ukraine might do in the event that this Ukrainian offensive fails, or fails to achieve any significant breakthrough. He says we mustn't negotiate, we must redouble, we must double down, triple down, we must provide Ukraine with even more support. But what if the Russians have other plans? After all, they are producing more shells, more tanks. They're now producing many more drones. Now, Putin had a meeting the other day discussing drone production in Russia. This was in Moscow. Huge numbers of officials and companies were there. The discussion was principally, at least the public parts of the discussion were principally about civilian drones for the civilian economy. But there's no doubt at all that the Russians are stepping up production of military drones also. Anyway, so the Russians are making more drones, they're making more tanks, they're making more fighter jets, they're making more of everything, they're training more of their troops. Their troops are going to be fully trained and ready to fight. Well, they probably already are to a great extent, and they might be even more so by the autumn, and they will have weathered this Ukrainian offensive, or so both Nichols and Kemp and lots of others appear to think likely. And the Ukrainians will have suffered losses, and they will have lost more tanks, more machines, more ammunition, and it will be next to impossible for the West to replace them. We've discussed many times in many programs the difficulty the West has experienced in replacing machines, tanks, aircraft, bombs, missiles, ammunition that Ukraine has lost. And these problems, as Brian Beletic also says, are getting worse. So, why should the Russians simply sit idly and accept a stalemate? Ukraine launches its offensive, the offensive fails to break through, and then the Russians are supposed to sit back, presumably, and do nothing, enabling Mr. Kemp and Mr. Nichols and others to go on saying we mustn't negotiate, we mustn't even think about negotiating, we must double down in some way, we must think about supplying Ukraine with more ATACMS missiles perhaps. They will take some weeks to months probably to arrive. They might not be as effective as we hope. But also F-16s, well, that will take about a year to get the Ukrainians up to speed in training them. But, that might not work well either. Anyway, the point is that the Russians are supposed to sit idly by whilst the West and the Ukrainians do whatever it is that they choose to do, except it mustn't be negotiations. Well, we've now had a comment by a Russian official which suggests that the Russians might not be willing to simply sit back after the failure of the Ukrainian offensive, twiddling their thumbs and doing nothing. Now, Dmitry Medvedev, who is the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council and also the deputy head of Russia's Military Industrial Commission, he is the person, in other words, who is in charge, overall charge of Russia's war economy at the present time. Anyway, he's now published another one of his extremely fiery telegram messages. Now, a lot of what Medvedev says is way over the top. Some of it, I'm afraid, is, frankly, I find rather tasteless trolling of the Western powers. Some of it, I think, is incendiary and, frankly, borders on the reckless, especially the way in which he sometimes talks about nuclear weapons as well. But I did notice that buried in his latest comment, he says this. He says that after what he predicts is the failure of the Ukrainian offensive, he says that the Russian response must be as follows. The mass destruction of the personnel and military equipment involved by the regime in the counteroffensive, with a maximum military defeat inflicted on Ukrainian troops, a full rout of the enemy, and the final deposition of the Kiev regime with its full demilitarization on entire Ukrainian territory. Retaliatory acts against the regime's key figures, regardless of the place of their location and the limitation period. In other words, total victory. That's what Medvedev says the Russians should seek. They should aim to totally destroy the Ukrainian forces committed to this offensive. And having destroyed those forces, they should go on and wage unlimited war, ending in regime change in Kiev, and a regime change encompassing entire Ukrainian territory, including Ukrainian territory, presumably in western Ukraine. Now, I don't know whether Medvedev is setting out here what are Russian plans. Probably not. But what I do suspect is that he is articulating what the more hardline personalities within Russia's government are urging. He appears to believe that the Russians have it within their power to destroy Ukraine's army, the army that is going to be committed to this offensive. And he insists that that must happen. And he then wants Russia not to sit idly by, but to go on the attack and to finish this war once and for all, presumably this year, overthrowing the government in Kiev, hunting down the various members of that Ukrainian government and establishing control over the entirety of Ukraine's territory, with presumably a new government, a more compliant government put in place. Now, I'm not saying that any of this is going to happen, and as I said, I rather doubt that Medvedev is talking here for everybody within Russia's government. I think there's probably a spectrum of views. I suspect there's a continuous ongoing debate about how to proceed in this war and what to do. But the fact that this debate is happening at all shows how extremely unwise it is to think that if the Ukrainian offensive proves underwhelming in its effect, that the West has the space and the time to double down, to go on supporting Ukraine beyond the failure of this offensive. I'm going to say this straightforwardly. I think what Nichols and Kemp are trying to do is that they're, certainly in Nichols' case, perhaps not so much in Kemp's, they're trying to say that a Ukrainian offensive that doesn't achieve its stated objectives, as I said, almost certainly agreed upon in discussions which took place in Kiev and Washington and London and Brussels all the way back last summer. If this offensive fails to achieve these results, destroying the Russian forces, making Russian control of Crimea untenable, defeating the Russian army, breaking through to the Sea of Azov, if Ukraine is only able to achieve a certain amount of limited progress, if it captures perhaps a score of kilometers of territory, even at the cost of 5,000 to 10,000 men, well, that's still some sort of success, and we can go on pretending that it is. And the worst we will have to deal with is a stalemate, because, well, the Russians aren't realistically going to do anything. I'm going to say it straightforwardly. I take a different view. If this offensive fails to achieve its objectives, then it has failed. It is as simple as that. Either, if you launch an offensive like this, especially after this enormous build-up time and that's been taking place over so many months, if you launch an offensive and you don't achieve your objectives, then that offensive is a failure, however hard you try to spin it. If before that offensive you start assessing that those objectives are most unlikely to be achieved, then I would have thought, not a military person, but I would have thought that that is an argument for calling the whole thing off, not for pressing on and launching something that will leave you in a weaker position and might expose you to the kind of counterattack that Medvedev clearly wants and of which the Russians most probably will be capable if the offensive fails. Well, there we are. As my colleague Alex Christoforou said in a recent video that we did on the Duran, the problem with this offensive is that it has gained a life of its own. It no longer matters whether it makes sense in military terms or not. My sense is that having talked about it for so long, having discussed it incessantly, having sent tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and trained troops in order to carry it out, it's now politically impossible just to sit back and call it off. Ukrainian leaders themselves might have their doubts about the wisdom of launching an offensive, but as a Russian official, I think it was Yan Gagin, said the other day, having provided all this hardware, the West now can accept nothing less than an offensive, because if an offensive fails to take place, Western governments, Western leaders, perhaps even Western electorates will start to feel shortchanged. And most probably there's been discussions and debates within the West. There's all sorts of people like, well, neocons in the United States who continue to refuse to even contemplate the possibility of failure, and they're shouting down anybody who suggests it, and who sense, by the way, that, again, if the offensive fails to take place, that will leave them in a weakened position in the bureaucratic power struggles that routinely happen. And they can't, of course, countenance that either. So we're going to get this offensive, despite the doubts, despite the concerns. We hope that even if 5,000 to 10,000 Ukrainians die in a failed attempt to achieve a breakthrough, well, we will still have a stalemate situation, that the Russians will do nothing and will allow us to spend weeks, months, years even, rebuilding another Ukrainian army to hurl at them again. I find it all dismal and desperate, but there we are. That's, I'm afraid, where we stand as of today in the military in military terms. Now, in military terms in relation to the war. Now, I'm going to say cover one more topic in this program, and that is the topic of President Erdogan. There's still rumors that he did have a heart attack, despite the fact that, as I said yesterday, he attended the ceremony of the launching of the Akuyu nuclear power station. He's now appeared at an air show, I believe, in Turkey, looking apparently quite well. I doubt that someone could recover so quickly from a heart attack, even if it was a relatively light heart attack. The official story, the official claim from the Turkish authorities is that he suffered some kind of gastrointestinal problem. In other words, he had a stomach upset. They can be pretty unpleasant, as we all know. I suspect that's probably the truth of it. The other story, which is a very weird one, but I do want to just touch on it, is that there's been an enormous amount of discussion in the United States about this very bizarre story about the giant panda that the Chinese loaned to the Memphis Zoo 20 years ago, and which is now returned to China now that the loan period of its presence in Memphis Zoo has ended. And there's stories about how the fact that the Chinese welcomed the return of this panda is a sign of Chinese hostility to the United States, and how Chinese television has been contrasting the well-being of the Chinese pandas in the Moscow Zoo with the thin and threadbare look of this panda. I have to say, I find all this very weird. I've not followed the story at all. But the fact that this kind of coverage is taking place is a further sign of how bad relations at the political and also now the public level between China and the United States have become. And this brings me to the comments of the Chinese ambassador to France, which I covered a couple of days ago on one of my programs. Now, the way the story was spun was that the Chinese ambassador gave an account of how Crimea was transferred to Ukraine by Khrushchev's government back in 1954, And I pointed out that that was absolutely the case, and I couldn't understand why anybody should take exception to those comments when they are factually correct. And of course, the media in the West also suggested that the ambassador had cast doubt on the sovereignty, the legitimacy of some of the republics that had emerged following the Soviet Union's collapse. And I thought that was I assumed that was probably true, and I suspected that he was talking about Ukraine. Well, I did a roundtable program on Gonzalo Lira's program, and a Chinese commentator, an actual Chinese commentator, joined us, and she was able to explain that this is totally and completely wrong, that in fact all the ambassador was doing was simply pointing out that states can have sometimes clouded origins. The Baltic states, for example, did not participate in the series of agreements that led to their independence and which brought about the collapse of the Soviet Union, something which incidentally is true. He was not seeking to deny the sovereignty or independence or legitimacy of the Baltic states. And more importantly, this commentator, this person who apparently runs a significant channel which broadcasts and is watched in China and who follows Chinese opinion closely, she says that the real story, at least in China, about this interview between the Chinese ambassador and this French journalist, it was a television interview, was the incredibly rude and aggressive behavior throughout the interview of the French journalist towards the Chinese ambassador. Now, I haven't seen this interview, but I can well believe it. I've watched interviews of Western journalists with Russian officials, including Putin and Lavrov, and the level of disrespect and discourtesy that they show to the people they're interviewing has been astonishing. They constantly interrupt, they constantly seek to cut off replies that Putin, Lavrov and others are giving. They behave in a sarcastic and rude manner. And sometimes, I have to say this, I've seen them raise their voices and try to shout down the people that they're trying to shout the people they're interviewing down, which is absolutely, to my mind, not what an interview is supposed to be like. Now, if this interview with the Chinese ambassador was anything like that, which I suspect it was, then I can completely understand why people in China are furious about it. It would also explain, by the way, why the Chinese government has been extremely wary of publicizing the facts of this interview, because, of course, coming so soon after the visit of Macron to China, when the Chinese went out of their way to try to win Macron over to their way of thinking, they might not want to publicize the fact within China itself that other people in France treat a Chinese diplomat in this kind of way. And I was told that Chinese opinion, public opinion, is not only outraged by the interview, but that some people in China are actually angry with the Chinese government for not responding much more harshly to the way in which this French interview was conducted, and to the humiliation and mistreatment of the Chinese ambassador, and by extension of China itself. And apparently a particular thing that stuck for many people was certain very critical comments that this French interviewer made of Mao Zedong, a person obviously that many people in the West have very strong views about, but who, despite all of that, is still remembered in China as the person who founded the current Chinese state and who set China on its trajectory, which has eventually and has led to its revival. And again, apparently this did not go down at all well with Chinese people. Again, something, by the way, which I would not find at all surprising. Imagine, for example, if Chinese interviewers were to start to say very critical things in an interview with an American or British politician about American or British political leaders of the past, people like, say, Thomas Jefferson or Winston Churchill, about whom many criticisms could be made, especially in Churchill's case, I suspect. It might not be very well received in the United States or Britain. I have to say that I think that relations between China and the United States are very fast coming to the point of no return. I discussed a few days ago Janet Yellen's speech about China, which incredibly some people still treating as an olive branch to China. In my opinion, it wasn't that at all. It was, on the contrary, a very aggressive speech, which was basically saying to the Chinese, look, it's take it or leave it. Either you submit to us or relations between us will deteriorate further still. And it seems to me that there's now been an even more aggressive and clear-cut speech from our old friend Jake Sullivan. Now, on the face of it, he was talking about the United States protecting its high technology industries, putting what he called high fence around a small yard. But again, the way he talked about that will undoubtedly be seen in China as further proof, despite Jake Sullivan's denials, that the United States is trying to obstruct high technology sales to China with a view to preventing China's future economic development. And if that was not the intention, I have to say that I think that this would be done in a completely different way, given the overblown, very heated anti-Chinese rhetoric taking place in the United States at the moment. I've no doubt at all that the Chinese are right. So, as I said, I think that US-China relations are now very close to, as I said, the point of no return. And I am sorry to say that it seems that leaders of other countries, European countries, look like they're preparing to follow the American lead on this. Robert Habeck, Germany's Vice Chancellor, Germany's economics minister, one of the key figures in the Green Party, seems yet again to be of the same views as Germany's foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock. Baerbock recently went to China, where again she was spectacularly rude about China, in ways that she no doubt thinks is courageous, but in ways which, in my opinion, are completely inconsistent with the proper conduct of a diplomat. Anyway, apparently Habeck has now given out instructions about ways in which Germany can find its way to cut its dependence on China in certain critical sectors. In other words, he and the Green Party apparently now Atlanticists to the core are preparing to follow the United States in these anti-Chinese policies or Chinese policies, just as they have with Russia, disregarding the fact that this might not be in Germany's long-term economic interests, or so I think. Anyway, there we are. Just wanted to tidy up this video, to close this video with these two topics. Erdogan is still there. I think that, as I said, relations between the United States and China are now close to total breakdown, and I'm afraid that the Europeans appear to be joining in. That's me for today. More from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all of our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop with its magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, remember to take the like button and check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.